Representative Liz Cheney is currently being held up by the establishment press as a stalwart defender of democracy because she disagrees with Donald Trump's big lie about election fraud. She actually accepted reality, objective reality, that Donald Trump did not win the 2020 election. But here's the thing. While she only openly disagrees with his rhetoric, she is endorsing the policy positions on voting and voting restriction pushed by Donald Trump. In fact, she recently talked with Axios's Jonathan Swan about why we need more, or I should say, in her words, less voting. Take a look.
You don't see any linkage between Donald Trump saying the election's stolen and then Republicans in all of these state legislatures rushing to put in place these restrictive voter laws?
Well, I think you have to look at the specifics of each one of those efforts. I think if you look at the Georgia laws, for example, there's been a lot that's been said nationally about the Georgia voter laws that turns out not to be true.
But even the Republican Lieutenant Governor of Georgia, Jeff Duncan, said that when this bill started to pick up momentum was when Rudy Giuliani was testifying that the Georgia election was a sham.
All right, so basically what Swan is coming around to the point of, it's like, no, the reason that these laws are being put forward is because of the big lie. You have Republicans that are like, oh, look at that. Oh, see, we need voter ID. We got undocumented people voting. We got dead people voting. And they all voted for Joe Biden, of course. And that's why Donald Trump lost and actually had really won the election. But they said that he lost because of some weird plot. But don't worry. We're going to put in laws that will make it harder for people to vote. Because something election can, security. Okay. So here's the thing. Donald Trump wanted to rig the election in his favor after the fact. But what the Republican Party is doing, and has been doing for a long time, is to rig the elections ahead of time, beforehand. The result, of course, would be the same. Republicans stay in power for perpetuity. That's good for the Republican Party. This is not complicated. And the problem with voter ID, and I know there's a lot of people that are like, oh, come on, voter ID. What's the problem? They can go and get a card, and it's fine. And don't you care about election security? False argument. False argument. The problem with voter ID is how difficult, not just difficult, but annoying it is to get, and basically how there are so many different barriers to being able to exercise your vote, to elect your representative. For example, most working people are really not able to get time off to go sit at the Secretary of State to get an ID. I mean, that's a fact for any working person. Well, you're going to, spend an hour, 2 hours sitting at the Secretary of State to go and get a voter ID. I mean, if you're a working class person who's working 2 or 3 jobs to survive, you're going to have time for that. Just saying. Not only that, but the thing about that is that the whole thing about putting barriers isn't a bug. It's a feature. So look at the breakdown of people who can't get or don't get an ID. 18%, almost 6 million citizens over the age of 65 do not have a photo ID. Most likely because, well, they're 65 or older. You generally don't have to drive anymore. You don't have to work anymore, really. And so transportation is difficult to find, often on fixed income, Social Security, things like that. 16% of Latino voters do not have a government-issued photo ID as well. 25% of voting age African Americans, that's huge. 5.5 million people do not have ID. 15% of voting age Americans who earn less than $35,000 a year also do not have a valid ID. These are the groups that Republicans don't want to vote. And most, not all, but many of these groups do happen to vote for Democrats. So it certainly seems like it's a partisan attack on the Democratic voter base in a way that we never see happen towards the Republican base. Think about it this way. Democrats have never attacked voting when it comes to Republicans, when it comes to the Republican base. It's completely unheard of. You never see it happen because it doesn't happen. Whereas the Republican Party consistently tries to restrict the vote, tries to make it so that certain groups have to go through so many different barriers in order just to be able to enter the political discussion. So, and I know a lot of conservatives, by the way, and some even, liberals have said, well, okay, but what's the problem with voter ID if you just make it free? All right, well, free should come with an asterisk, because it turns out there are cities who promise a free ID. However, it turns out not necessarily being free. In fact, it can get very expensive depending on what paperwork is needed in order to get your so-called free ID. In fact, multiple documents are required to get the free ID, just like any other government-issued photo ID. Required documents can include a birth certificate, social security card, citizenship papers, proof of residency, and anybody who's requested these forms before or who hasn't requested these forms before, you don't know how expensive it is. I mean, they charge you for getting your own birth certificate, and it can take quite a long time to have it shipped to your house, to have it mailed to you. And so not only that, but again, a lot of people don't have access to those birth certificates, might not know that they need them before an election, and then will run out of time. Not only that, but think of people who are temporarily homeless, people who've lost their house, people, you could have a fire and all your stuff burnt down. Natural disasters, those who move frequently, or look, you could just lose it. That happens. Not only that, but interestingly enough, and I didn't know this fact, Americans born in Puerto Rico had all of their birth certificates that were issued before 2010 invalidated. So you have to all get a new one. I didn't know that. So now, not having a birth certificate is pretty common, and getting a replacement, again, can be difficult, expensive, or both. Not only that, but getting there's that issue with transportation. If you don't have a photo ID, most likely you don't have a license either, because a license can be considered to be a photo ID. Well, who are less likely? People who don't have cars, people who don't can't really afford their own car, people who live in the inner city, who take public transportation. They don't have a driver's license. Why would you need one? And why would you go and spend money on that? And so getting those can be a challenge, and even getting to the places to get those special IDs that are supposedly free can be expensive. And so not only that, but it's also time sensitive and time intensive. And so let me give you another example here. People in rural areas, you live out in the country, well, it might be pretty difficult for you to get to a Secretary of State, right? It could be miles away. And if you don't have a license, odds are you don't have your own vehicle. And some states, by the way, like Alabama, recently paired their new voter ID laws with the closures of Secretary of State's or DMV offices in predominantly black areas. So we know what this is about. It's very clear. Liberals like to call this a solution in search of a problem. But for once proposing these laws, putting them in place, well, no, they already know the so-called problem. Their problem is black people voting. They don't want people to vote. Paul Weyrich, by the way, the guy that launched all these so-called conservative organizations, the Heritage Foundation, Moral Majority, and all the groups that are pushing this, openly admitted that he doesn't want people to vote. Why? Because if they do, Republicans lose. That's what voter ID in America is ultimately about. It's not like in other nations, by the way, where they do have photo IDs. Because again, I've gotten into arguments with conservatives over this, and they're like, well, such and such country has a voter ID system over in Europe. Okay, but they also don't actively do voter suppression like we do here in America. That said, there's more in this interview with Swan. In fact, she's gonna go on to struggle to come up with defenses against Swan's questioning. Take a look.
I don't think anyone doubts that the reason 400 some voting bills have been introduced 90% by Republicans, supported by the Republican National Committee. I don't think it's a coincidence after the election that this has happened.
Look, I think everybody should want a situation and a system where people who ought to be able to vote and have the right to vote can vote, and people who, don't, shouldn't. And again, I come back to things like
But what problem
voter
are
ID.
they solving for? Like, there's
Well,
not like, what
look,
are all these states doing?
No, I think, each state is different.
What was the big problem in Georgia that needed to be solved by a new law? What was the big problem in Texas? What was the big problem in Florida? These laws are coming all around the states, and like, what are they solving for?
I think you've got to look at each individual state law. But I think what we can all agree on...
You can't divorce them from the context.
Well,
come on.
yeah, but I think what we can agree on is that what is happening right now is really dangerous.
And I can agree with that.
When I think about 2000, think about sitting on the inaugural platform in January of 2001, watching Al Gore. Of course, we had won. I'm sure he didn't think he had lost. Mm-hmm. We had fought this politically very, very intense battle, and he conceded. He did the right thing for this nation. And that is one of the big differences between that and what we're dealing with now, and the danger of Donald Trump today.
Yeah, I'm probably going to blow your mind, but I'm pretty sure there was that whole, hanging chads effery that happened. Jeb Bush in Florida. I think Al Gore, if he had pushed it, actually did win. He did get the popular vote, and he didn't push hard enough. There is a difference, and I know, like, Donald Trump. No. Al Gore didn't ask for a recount at all. He gave up. And it was his right, in this case, to be able to call for a recount. But anyway, the thing about what she's saying is, basically she dodged the question. This is a masterclass example of being able to dodge and weave without giving an answer to a question, because she has no answer. These laws are not solving any problem. They're there to make sure black voters are disenfranchised and that Republicans continue to win. That's it. Some examples, again, for these laws. Restrictions on voting by mail. Who votes by mail? Well, a lot of people, actually. But during the pandemic, during the 2020 election, after Donald Trump had spent months and months saying, don't vote by mail. You shouldn't vote by mail. It's full of voter fraud. Well, then suddenly people changed their minds. Less Republicans voted by mail, and Democrats, the same number, actually probably more Democrats voted by mail because of the pandemic. And so this is a good example of something that used to be not controversial, that got super controversial for no goddamn reason, is vote by mail. Look, very, very, very few instances of mail-in ballot fraud, voting by mail, or absentee ballot fraud. It's just not a thing that's happened. Again, voting by mail in Oregon has been done for over a decade with very, very infinitesimally small amounts of actual fraud. And so this is, again, supposedly a solution in search of a problem. But again, they already know the problem. For them, it's black people voting. Now, there's more. Let's see. Another restriction that I've talked about before. You can't give water to people standing in line. Well, who ends up having to wait in line to vote? Black voters. Who has to bear the brunt of all the numerous roadblocks put in the way of voting? Black people. Yeah. Not only that, but from closing down of polling places to programs like Chris Kobach's interstate cross-check, voter purges, making certain types of protests illegal, and then, of course, making sure that felons do not have a right to vote. We see that it's pretty goddamn clear what is going on here. And the thing is, they're too stupid. They think we're too stupid to realize what's actually going on. Yeah. And so the thing is, and what completely invalidates Liz Cheney and makes her look like a complete raging hypocrite, is that all of this stuff is based on what is it? These voter ID laws are based on voter fraud, right? The big lie is also based on voter fraud. You say you don't believe it, Liz, but you're out here defending the very policies created that give credence to the big lie itself. And why is she doing that? Because at the end of the day, she's one of them. She's a ghoul. Most of the Republicans in office only want one thing, and that's power. Hell, honestly, most politicians do. That's why a lot of people get into politics. Power. But Republicans can no longer count on winning the majority anymore. That's why they cheat. Their ideas are unpopular. They're out of step with the American people and favor a tiny group of elite billionaires and large corporations, while pretending, of course, that, oh, no, we're for the little guy. No, we're for the little guy. We're for working people, except that all of our policies hurt working people and favor corporations. And so, again, what they do is they cheat, they gerrymander, they suppress their way into office, and then use those same tools to make sure they stay in office. Donald Trump only tried to do that after the fact, and in so doing, ripped the mask off what the party has been doing for a very, very long time prior to the vote. And all Liz Cheney wants to do is politely put the mask back on and continue on as if nothing happened. And who knows, maybe challenge Trump if he's going to run in 2024. Do not be fooled by the Liz Cheneys of the world. We know what they're about. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and share with your friends. You can subscribe and help out the channel by becoming a patron. It's patreon.com/Jeff Waldorf, or you can become a channel member as well by hitting the join button below.